So I'd like to welcome everyone to the first Misophonia professional and academic collaboration workshop. We're delighted that you're attending today. We currently have 32 individuals attending, which I think is just fantastic. And so let's get right on with our program today. But first, let me just a quick comment to say thank you to organizers and presenters, psychologist Jim Claiborne, audiologist Marsha Johnson, and I guess myself is not a thank you, but a fact. So let me introduce Marsha Johnson. Marsha Johnson is a fantastic audiologist. She first identified misophonia as a unique condition. Oh, that changed. As a unique condition back in 1997, and she called it selective sound sensitivity syndrome or soft sound sensitivity syndrome. And she developed a protocol for helping these individuals called the Misophonia Management Protocol. She's trained a number of professionals from audiologists to help to provide this protocol. She's treated several thousand individuals. Marsha, is it over 5,000 yet? I don't know. It's a very, very large number of individuals. I know several thousand. She's been a tireless advocate for individuals with misophonia. She organized the first professional course for audiologists on misophonia. She organized the Misophonia Association conference in 2013. We thought we had an established Misophonia Association in 2013, but it wasn't official in 2014. So, Marsha, I'm going to turn it over to you and look forward to your presentation. So, Marsha, are you hearing us okay?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I apologize, but your voice to me cycles in and out, and I am completely losing auditory comprehension about 50% of the time. Just maybe just me, but I hope just me. If anybody else is having that difficulty, let us know.
So go ahead, Marsha. It's your turn.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming, everyone. Yeah, it's early in Oregon, and it's very challenging to try to compress information gathered over several decades into a short presentation, but I'll do my best. I recognize a lot of names on the roster, and I'm so excited to be here. So, and then we'll look into how to apply sound in therapy for misophonia. So let's start. So I always like to go over just briefly. I did see my first case in the fall of 1997. I had opened a tinnitus and hyperacusis treatment clinic all on my own. My mother gave me a couple $100 for rent, and I rented a space in a desolate strip mall that was about to be torn down, and that's where I started my work, and I was very happy. And along came a case from Canada, and these cases were swirling around because they didn't know where to go. They thought maybe it was a form of hyperacusis, and this was the time when some of the big players in our field believed hyperacusis was only a psychological condition. So people who had these kinds of symptoms were kind of just thrown around between professionals. So this girl's dad drove her down from British Columbia. So I spent a couple hours with them, and everything I tested was normal, and I finally started getting an understanding when her dad pretended to chew his fingernails, and she ran out of the clinic screaming and crying and sat on the curb. So this case was interesting, and I started applying sound generators right in that moment, and for her, it was quite an improvement. So she was my first case, and I thought she was just an odd duck. However, by the time Christmas came around, I had 2 or 3 more cases, and it was odd because they were all beautiful girls in their teens, smart, successful students, and they all described the same phenomena. Kind of a sudden onset, a family member, eating noises, strong emotional and physiologic responses, no history of any disease, or couldn't find anything wrong in an auditory profile, perfect hearing, perfect everything I could find. And so I began speaking about these cases. At the time, there was a group on the internet, a new group, it was way back when, and there was a group of people in a hyperacusis group, and so I started speaking about these cases there. And that group went on to become the Hyperacusis Network, which was founded by Dan Malkar, who was a funeral director with hyperacusis, and it's still going on today. By the time 1999 came along, I had collected around 800 people on that group with very similar symptoms from all around the country, mostly Western people, because the fact is you needed to have access to the internet. And so I started this little group for people with just these symptoms. There was a lot of sort of arguing going on in my world. I kept seeing patterns. I hadn't seen 800 people by then. Maybe I had seen 50 or 100 people. But I had been corresponding with people all over the world who were reporting identical etiologies. And I would try to bring this up at conventions or professional meetings, and I was told so many interesting things. I was crazy, that I was interfering with something I shouldn't be doing. These people were crazy. I had, of course, a close relationship and still do with Pavel Jastreboff, and he was also mystified. They didn't fit into any of our categories in TRT, and I was quite active in TRT and still am. And, he was referring to psychologists, and we were actually treating patients and working together, but at the same time, his primary work, of course, was in tinnitus and in hyperacusis. So I think I was collecting more because of my internet preference. And these patterns started to emerge, and you could read them there. They're typically 90% of them, and I've done surveys of up to 1,000 people, and I've presented at different places, but they typically have onset in childhood around pre-puberty, and it tend to be more females than males, and their triggers are mostly auditory, but there is a huge visual component. Their initial trigger person is generally a parent or a sibling, and the reactions of the children, teenagers, is intense and immediate, and there is a strong emotional content, as well as body sensations, and over time the number of triggers tends to increase. And I should mention, I came up with this word trigger, and in '99 I had needed to call it something, and so I was thinking a lot about it, and I worked actually on the Hyperacusis Network, suggested things, and people suggested, and I came up with Selective Sound Sensitivity Syndrome, or 4S. I didn't trademark that name. I published some things underneath it, but it's bounced around. It's called 4S. It's on commercial products people are selling. I don't particularly care about things like that, but this huge group of people was just so interesting and in a way so helpless, had trouble finding help. Now, in the early years, and still today, you need to have an approach. Why do they end up with audiologists? Well, because they go into their pediatricians or their doctors and say, my hearing is too sensitive, so I'm hearing these things that bother me, and so physicians often send them for a hearing evaluation. And they think maybe it might be hyperacusis or something, and so they're referring them to our profession or other professions, of course, too now, but and at the time also, or trying medications. But over time I came up with a way to help them called the Misophonia Management Protocol. And I was in contact during the 90s and the early 2000s with other audiologists across the country who had some interest, like I did, in tinnitus and hyperacusis, and I was sharing with those people. So a little informal network had founded, and basically we put together a variation of tinnitus retraining therapy using sound-generating equipment and then a supportive educational counseling, sometimes paired with cognitive therapy or psychological counseling for anxiety or issues that sort of we could identify that were primary. And around the same time, too, I developed slowly the Misophonia Assessment Questionnaire, the MAQ. It's used quite widely today. I have to say, though, it's informal. I've never done the process. I'm not a PhD researcher, I'm sorry, and I'm so busy in my clinic. I'm not even sure I remember how from grad school on how to run things, but it has been useful, and I've distributed it widely, and anybody can use it. And I think it is useful for pre and post assessments. And then I've also developed a number of materials over the years on assessment protocols. We do them. 99.9% of these people have absolutely normal hearing. They might have slight loudness discomfort level results, but slight. They're not hyperacusic. And occasionally you'll run into somebody that has more than one issue. And another area I've really expanded on the last few years has been the development of the questionnaires, rating scales for families and siblings. And I want to say right now, misophonia is a family disorder. It's a global effect on the family happiness, unity, joy. It is a devastating kind of an explosive factor for families. Very difficult. So coming down here, what is misophonia? Well, we still don't have a definition. I'm sorry. We have the abnormal response, an auditory response to the limbic system that Pavel developed initially as a phrase, but the fact is that his friend came up with his name in the early, 2000, 2001, miso meaning hatred, phonia sound, and it's very difficult for me to use the term. I always say this because my patients don't hate sound. They like sound. They only have trouble with certain sounds. And moreover, there is an enormous visual component. Enormous. When I first began to collect data on that in the late 90s, I didn't realize it was 40 to 50% of these individuals have a very discrete problem with visual stimuli. And that's something that needs investigation. So, just checking over here to see if there's any. Yeah, no questions yet. Okay. So, we need a definition, and it's a multi-sensory system issue. It's not just auditory, and it certainly isn't hatred of sounds. And in addition to the visual aspect, there's also some tactile and olfactory responses. There's a very tiny group of people that apparently via the vagus nerve or some nerve system that maybe runs down the spine, they have a very low abdominal type response that can even actually be sort of an arousal response that is very disturbing to these individuals. They're a very tiny subset, and they're often hesitant to talk about it because it's just so strange. It does need more investigation, and we do need a definition. I know that the folks in the Netherlands have come up with a psychological definition, but that creates issues for basically a cross-field condition, which is physiologic and has psychological overlay or components. And I spend a lot of time talking to my patients about how we are one being. You can, for fun, take away our thinking and feelings away from our body, but, we are one entity, and I believe myself, after 20 years at Misophonia, is a physiologic disorder, not dissimilar to diabetes. So let me go on to the next one. The middle history of the whole background is just, I had been friendly with a woman named Joyce Cohen, who is an author and a real estate writer, and she and her husband suffer from terrible, painful, decreased sound tolerance, very disabling for her husband, and we had met on the Hyperacusis Network, and she was interested in writing an article. She saw my struggles over the years, and she had been doing a little investigation with even being able to talk about it, frankly, for a while. I will mention one funny story for those of you in the field. So I had written 4S all over the Hyperacusis Network, and at the time, the lay people who were on the list decided that it wasn't a legitimate condition, and so they went backwards in time and spent time to erase every reference on the Hyperacusis Network archives to selective sound sensitivity, and they replaced it with the word misophonia. So it was a battleground, and she had observed all of this, and I was very stubborn, and I just kept chugging on my track like a good little train out here in the West, because I knew what was in front of me. I could see what was in front of my own eyes. And so she decided to write an article. It got accepted in the New York Times, and I knew it was going to be published. And so I just mentioned that because at that point, it's very daunting to be basically a single-person clinic with a part-time office manager, and you're going to have your name in the New York Times, and it's going to talk about this. And indeed, I spent the pre-6 months when I knew it was coming gathering together 9 other audiologists I knew very well around the country, and we formed a group called the Misophonia Provider Group, and I put together more information on the MAQ and the Misophonia Management Protocol, and then I tried to prepare, and I did end up getting like 5,000 plus telephone calls, emails in those first few months, and there was no structure to receive, you know. It's like some kind of story from the Bible where you put the net in and you get 1 million fish and you have nowhere to put them, much less what to do. But it was exciting. And, here's a question. It says, expound about how it's not dissimilar to diabetes. Well, I'm not sure if everybody can read that. So Joy says, can you talk about that briefly? I will talk before I move on, because diabetes is a better example for people with misophonia than, for example, thinking about like spiders and phobias. It's my opinion. I'm not a physiologist. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm just I'm an audiologist in Oregon, but I have observed that it's my opinion that 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14-year-old children, they don't think up these kinds of things. These things kind of onset to them. They are like hit by a tsunami. It's a tsunami kind of experience for these individuals and their families. And nobody, wants it less than the child who's affected, or the teen, or the young adult. I believe, because I've seen so many people with genetic links where I've treated fathers and daughters and mothers and sons and twins from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Too many cases where we have an enormous family history associated lightly with obsessive-compulsive disorder. I think this is a kissing cousin. I think it's hormone-provoked. I think pre-puberty, your brain is washing, submerged in this absolute flood of hormones. There's too many characteristics. When I talked to one of the researchers at the House Ear Institute that was specializing in genetics, he said, give me 500 blood samples and I'll show you the defective gene for this problem. And I was like, that sounds great. And he goes, and $2 million. I'm like, oh, well, can't do that. But somebody will do that. So because if you use the term diabetes with your patients, everybody quickly understands that people cannot fix diabetes by wanting to. If I have diabetes, I have to live a certain way, and I have to mind certain rules, and my family has to assist me. And misophonia has some similarities with the fact that people really want to not have it, and their families also really want them not to have it. And trust me, thousands of cases, I have seen every form of counseling, medication, exposure therapy, everything you can think of. And so far, we don't have, maybe a few self-proclaimed people who say they have been cured. I have not seen it. I see people who manage it and who improve, but I like to use that example with parents. It really helps parents and also the people that I'm talking to. Okay, hopefully that helps. It's really strange to have a seminar where you can't hear anyone. It's odd. Feels funny. Okay, back to business. So he already mentioned two of my best friends, Cindy Simon, audiologist in Florida, and Jolene Jaffe, a psychotherapist from California. We worked together to put on the first conference, and we have worked since that time, and the numbers are growing, and we've moved around the country, and this year in the fall, October, it'll be in Southern California, and we kind of like to take it abroad in 2017 and go to London. And we're getting a couple hundred people to come out and great presenters. And we're going to be doing a professionals course the Thursday before the Friday and Saturday convention. So we'll talk more about that. You can sort of look at Misophonia Association's website. Yeah, okay, Joy, will you make a place for us to come to London? We'd like to. I'm planning. The UK Misophonia group is really active. So this is all over the world. This is like, God took a handful of pebbles and threw them at the earth, and they're just scattered. They're everywhere, and they're very isolated. So it's sad because oftentimes they don't know anybody else that has this. So much comfort in misery loves company. So how do we use sound? Well, sound is just a really fundamental concept here. It makes perfect sense. So there's very few people I'd love to do testing. If I just had a laboratory, I could do that all day. But, so we have sound as humans. We are incredibly involved with sound in every way you can think of. And it permeates our entire brain. And there are many pathways that are emotional and cognitive and everything you could think of related to sound, and our whole body systems also are totally tied into it. So we have adrenaline and cortisol responses. We have all kinds of, all those wonderful hormones in your brain that make you feel happy, get angry. So how do we work with the sound, which is the bigger component? And, again, these problems start at home. It's a family member, and the negative response is an urgent one. I know that there's been a lot of use of the word rage, but that's just one component of this. It's a tsunami of emotions. It's an overwhelming experience. It is dominating and insistent and driving, and it can range from sort of an in-caving where the person collapses in tears and depression, anxiety, and fear to an outer externalized experience where they're going to strike something. So, or run away or hurt or do something. And again, very visceral response, precognition. Usually people are not analyzing when responding. It is a bodily level kind of response. So it leads me to suspect that the injury point, the defect, the glitch in the auditory system, the brain, is probably low level. And some of my hunches have been borne out recently by some research on fMRIs that are showing areas around the brain stem or the lower regions. So we're talking about precognition, and even having patients waking up out of a sound sleep for a very soft, imperceptible sound. So we all know instinctively that if we're having difficulty on vacation and there's people outside, we can turn the air conditioning on. We know how to use sound. to help block out noxious triggers or sounds. What kind of sounds? Well, these, of course, are the sounds that are most annoying to people that I have seen. Many of them are oral sounds, and there are other things too, but these kinds of things, and you already know this information, probably, you've got things, the noises that people make just when they eat. And the saddest cases are the dads coming in with the kids, and the dads are just trying to have dinner. They're working all day, coming home, and it's chaos. They feel guilty, they feel put upon, they feel mistreated. It destroys relationships. It is really sad, and it's sad for the child or the teen or the young adult too, who avoid their parents, avoid their trigger sounds. It just breaks up families, and it's just terrible. So there we are. Let's keep going here. I don't want to keep an eye on my time. So what's the frequency content of these sounds? If we're going to use ambient noise as therapy, we need to look at the frequency content. So a lot of times, remember, the difference between this and hyperacusis is decibel-driven. Misophonia is content-driven. And so the frequency sound is often higher pitched. Sometimes click can be compared, sniffing, very tiny, mouth sounds, breathing sounds. They're most often short in duration. Sometimes they're irregular. That's another component here. If it's once or twice and in sort of irregular presentations, person can be okay. If it kind of repeats, the longer it repeats, that's a challenge, becomes a challenge. And the brain begins to form an association of recognition, I believe, with particular sounds that form patterns, like fingerprints. And so the brain is a searching instrument. It's reaching out unconsciously and consciously, sometimes surveilling the territory for these sort of identified as dangerous fingerprints, imprints. And pattern recognition in the brain is very important here. So your eating a potato chip doesn't sound like my eating a potato chip because of your nasal cavity, the construction of your lips and tongue and teeth and habit. So these fingerprints of sounds are unique, and they are associated with an individual many, many times, although not always. Gum chewing is universally hated by most people with misophonia. Doesn't matter who's doing it, although there's an odd phenomena again where young children up to a certain age of responsibility are kind of excused. So we have some factors there to investigate once they're recognized. This is kind of important because we need to see how do we interfere with these sounds. And again, I put down here on the last little line here, anticipatory phase. It's a term I came up with, and this is pre-exposure anxiety and preparation by these people who know dinner is about to happen, or they're going to sit next to that colleague at a meeting who always smacks his lips and snorts. And this anxiety created by this is very difficult for this population. It's tiring. Okay, finally we come down to brain function. So what happens, we have this incredible system. We have a developing brain. We hear at around 4 months inside your mother. And again, I think I put this slide in here just because I wanted to say how heavily sound is tied into our survival, our reproduction, our ability to hunt and to notice what's hunting us. Very important. And we have to instantly associate sounds and sensory impressions with recognition. And we do this over many years, of course, of our long childhoods. But we have to be able to recognize those important signals to stay alive, and kind of forget about that in a way today, because we don't have to encounter that. But if you spend any time maybe around looking at native peoples and that kind of thing, it's a tremendous relationship, the precognition relationship And that function is very, very important to understand when you're talking to patients so that they understand they're not deciding or choosing to respond to a sound. It's happening kind of in spite of their wishes, and that it's a very, very strong, necessary response. But in this case, it is frustrating. So, how do I know all this? Well, because I've done thousands of evaluations in 20 years, conversations, connections, conventions, taken histories, stories, tried to help people as best I can all over the world. Most of it, has not been necessarily charged at some kind of clinical fee, because in the beginning, there was nothing to charge. So I would just try to do my best, and I would see these patients, and they would go away and try some things that we came up with. So I think there's a lot of evidence. I'm sitting on a gold mine of evidence right now in my little clinic here in Oregon, and if I ever have a time, I'm going to publish some of it. And there's a lot of theories. Of course, people jumped in and got involved, and there's a lot of theories. There's a question. You assert that patients will be wakened by sounds that will not wake other people. Is there any research trials? No. I'm sorry. This is the most under-researched issue that I've run across, but it's improving so much. There are at least a half dozen studies going on, and some have been published, and that has basically only been since about maybe 2014. So we're on the front end of something here. I wish there was, but there will be eventually. I know there will be. So we're getting like a talk right there, so that's good. So we're looking at wonderful physiologic studies coming forward that demonstrate defects in brain processing, and that really validates people's experience, and it really makes them feel good. So more from whatever field, we have to work together. Whatever field this data can come from, it would be amazing. Can I provide a reference? Yes, you can look I'll get back to you on that. It's been published, and Tom is providing something for you right there. That's Dr. Schroeder's work. He's a psychiatrist from the Netherlands, and they have a lot of work going on. A wonderful guy. So, again, sudden onset, extremely disturbing arrival of this condition, evidence by hundreds of patients, some relationship to hormones. There is a genetic condition that's just too obvious from the data that I have amassed myself over 2 decades. And then these repeating patterns from patient to patient. There are some outliers, but for the most part, the pattern is there. So why do we want to use ambient sound? Well, just about every patient says that quiet backgrounds are the worst places for them, and they do better when they're in noisy places. And children find that school is actually easier than home generally. They can rely on the background noise of their class. So lifting the ambient sound level has been known to assist in helping these patients to focus and to relax, improve their concentration and their feeling of wellness. And I've used a variety of sounds over the years, but primarily my tinnitus retraining therapy background, and I'm using ear-level devices, and I'll talk about that. It's cheap. It's easy to apply. You can use apps. You can use things already around the home, and you can provide kind of a fun activity to create a soundscape. I have a term I created, the environmental sound sculpting. So you're going home to look at your home and think of what can be in this room, what can be in that room, what can we do here. It's a good activity, a positive activity. And It's not harmful. There's no long-term responses. Sound works really well. That very first patient back in 97, I said, where were you going to school? And she said, no, I can't go to most classes, but I do go at lunch to visit with my friends. And I'm like, wow, lunch, you don't like eating sounds, but you go at lunch. And she said, yeah, we have 2,000 kids in our high school, and so the cafeteria is very noisy, and I can visit on the lunchtime. And I'm like, okay, she can be in noise. We have a little sound we use in audiology called cafeteria noise way back then, and so that's where I got this idea to go ahead and then flood her auditory system with noise and sound. So let's see, can you share your insight as to whether the condition is new? No, I don't think it's new. I think it was hidden. It isn't new. People remember ancestors that the grandpa that sat in the back and smoked until Thanksgiving dinner was over and somebody took him a plate because he wasn't hungry. Kind of antisocial. I don't think this condition is new. I think it has been, I think these people, here's the really sad part. These children, when they develop this, they understand within 2 or 3 experiences that they're not like the other people. There's something weird about them, something different. Most of the time parents think it's a behavioral problem, so they tell them to stop acting up, get to business, eat their dinner, go to bed, whatever. And they try. And the most common comment from patients over 20 years is, I thought I was crazy. So these kids decide at a very young age, I'm weird, I'm different, there's something wrong with me, and they get called highly sensitive, emotional, she's moody, a teenager. You know, it's kind of bad because it strikes at a time of life when kids are kind of some of those things, and it's unfortunate. But I think they go and they look around, but they go to a few doctor visits and things, some of them, and physicians don't know about it, and so they get classified as, you know, weirdos that have a problem. And it's sad. It's incredibly depressing. I try to keep a positive attitude, but some of these young children, you know, I've done some studies on parents, and some of these young children and teenagers, and they express suicidal ideation. They don't want to live like this. They can't stand it. It is so hard if your mom's your trigger, and all you want to do is sit next to your mom and be a child. And it's just unbelievable how difficult this is for these individuals, and I admire them so much. So here's what I put on in the 90s. This is what it looked like. It's the size of like a hamster. Can you imagine? That is actually a very large unit. That's what we were using at the time. The Vienna tone was the Jastroboff recommended instrument, and it was like, I don't know, it was big. I was thinking if I had one around here, put them on these little ears, and they'd be as big as their ears, and they wore them because they worked, and they, you know, I mean, they would have worn purple pom-poms if it would help. So that was our first instrument, and it provides a broadband noise. Now we have new generation. We have all sorts of ear-level devices that you can put into people's ears, and what's the point? We want to flood the auditory system with sound. We want to occupy every one of 70,000 fibers, 35,000 fibers per ear, plus you have central nervous system areas. And remember that sound goes into huge areas of our brain. It is enormously impactful. It is the way oxygen goes around to all of our cells, you know. Sound permeates so many areas of the human brain. Very important. I'll take that question, Helen, a little bit later there. There's a whole bunch of different ways we can deliver noise into the human ear and brain. If you are using the kind of devices I just showed you there, you must pair up or get with an audiologist or be an audiologist, because these are prescription devices. They're classified by the FDA, and they're medical devices. And there are some things you can get on your own now. It's getting more popular, mail order, all kinds of things you can order themselves. I prefer to stick to the mainstream I prefer actually Amplisound. I use it most of the time. It's the digital white chip that was developed by Natan Bauman and Pavel Jastrabov, and I really like it. It's durable, it's light, everybody can wear it. They repair them, they're under warranty for a year, and they're wonderful, and they can run in price anywhere from $1,200 for a set up to $2,500 for a set, and probably 85% of the people that I fit with really like them. So, you know, it's not just the devices, though. You can't just put devices on people. You have to really work with them, and you have to have a number of frequent contacts with them, especially in the beginning until they get comfortable. They can use them, and they understand. They come with adjustable volumes. Some of the instruments come with different types of noises, which people really like. You can choose a variety of sounds. And the sound quality is important. You want to find something comfortable. And also I really like to use as apps with rain, ocean, or waterfalls. And I've even recorded some waterfalls up in the Columbia Gorge here, subsurface recordings, and added frequency little bumps. And they seem to be somewhat popular, but the longer running without interruptions, the better. So music is a challenge because you have about every 3 minutes a pause. And then all the little birds come flying in those pauses and activate the auditory system. So it's better to have steady state sound if you can. These devices are important, and again, everybody who works with misophonic people should use sound as part of your therapy, increasing sound in some way or using sound as your friend. And it's always good to pair up with an audiologist. We're nice people, and you'll like working with us. We're good. For non-audiologists, you can use so many wonderful things. Phones come with all kinds of apps. I'm actually wearing today a cool set of Audio Technician Quiet Point noise canceling. I'm not sure I can get that where you see it. Noise canceling earbuds, which have an active component, battery operated thing. There are this wonderful family of sleep phones. It's a headband. Sleep phones you can purchase for $40 on Amazon, and it's a soft headband. You wear it plugged into your appliance and can deliver sound all night for people having trouble sleeping near loved ones with noises that they make. And the best thing, again, is neutral and continuous, and wear it when you need it and when you want to use it. Open ear fits are the best, we feel, or closed set like these, or headsets. Try to encourage your patients to apply the sound before the situation happens. Many of my students, younger people, put them on when they come home from school, or they wear them to school too. It depends on the level. The first 13-year-old cheerleader I saw from New Jersey, I think, I was like, she won't wear big giant things. Remember, they were the Vienna tones, but she certainly did, and I really love this girl. She's in her late 20s now, and I said, Katie, what do you think about wearing these? And she had cute blonde hair. She wore in a ponytail at school, and she said, well, anybody that doesn't like me because I have some ear gear on, she called it, I don't want to be their friend anyway, and my friends, they don't care. So she had a great attitude, and she's gone on to do wonderful things with her sound devices over the years. Let's see, there's some other questions here. Can meso be situation specific? Repeatedly while at home, dogs barking, but the exact same sound, same kids, same dogs. Absolutely. In another location, yeah. Familiarity breeds contempt for misophonic. So people that have an environmental aspect, like the dog barking, the basketball kids, they often move homes. They'll up and move. They'll disrupt their whole lives. They'll find a place they think quieter. Pretty soon it's the rain gutters. It's like that game Whack-A-Mole. So you get one thing down, another thing comes up. It's a challenge, absolutely. If familiarity breeds contempt, that's probably why we have this trigger person is the people you see repeatedly, and the brain starts acquiring an aversion, and then it's identified that pattern with this biochemical glitch of some sort. I don't know how that works, but I think it is it. And pretty soon, yeah, boyfriend, you have to get rid of him because it turns out his eating is annoying, or his breathing, or he sniffs, or he flaps his foot, or it's very it's a destructive disorder, and we need to put a lot of resources in this to try to overcome and understand it. So going back here, so I always advise my patients to bring car kit. So that's stuff in the car. Sometimes sunglasses can be very helpful for visual triggers. And I like to keep a headset in there, and your iPod and earplugs, and then you have to work out some understanding. So like if it's a person and your partner, when they talk on the cell phone, it's very annoying for you, and then you make an agreement that we're not going to talk on the cell phone in the car. You know, you have to come up with some agreements with people that you live with. Nature sounds are very good, combination sounds. Anything can be used. Tom calls his happy music, symphony sounds. Can be almost free, you know. But the best thing I have found, unfortunately, and they are expensive, is that ear-level gear. The audiology instruments work best because wherever you go, there you are, and it's constant, and it has a volume control right there. But these little guys are fun, and there's lots and lots of sounds that you can get and use successfully. And everybody can do this, and even wearing them a little louder. So this is just a little bit to justify what we're doing, and you can certainly write this up and make a paper to hand to your patients and to go over the benefits of sound as a friend and an assistant. It will not block out the sounds, and many of these patients, of course, have magical thinking, and they, even though you tell them 100 times, this is not going to fix it, it's not going to stop the sounds from coming in, your auditory system is fantastic, it's working perfectly, and the brain will go out and seek these noxious triggers and bring them to your attention, but it's going to help. This is going to be an assistant. It's going to make it better. It'll cushion the blow a little bit. It will relax and let you put the mind, your mind on something else. When I put these devices onto people, I always tell them they look like they're eating ear candy because their brain is tasting with a lot of relief these 70,000 signals that are now filling up and occupying every neural pathway. And it's a relief. It's like scratching an itch, and 85% of people who try these devices for a trial period will say at the end of the time, I'm better off with them than without them. 85%. It's very high. So you can relax some of the hypervigilance. Having misophonia is exhausting. It's absolutely fatiguing, and allows people, reports have come back for 20 years that they can concentrate and think, and even one patient said I could read a book for the first time. You can use them all day. You can sleep in them at night if you can. There's no long-term side effects. You could feel like you have more control over a situation, and that helps a lot because the lack of control is certainly a huge issue for people. They're very easy to use. I have a 5-year-old patient many years ago who's now probably 18. He's Nicky in California that could take care of him totally himself. And it's easy to access and easy to use. Let's see. I have several patients who have used earbuds, including the canal music, and sensitivities have increased. I'm assuming to the trigger sounds. So people wearing earbuds and music, and then while they're using them, the sensitivity, or when they took them out. How does ambient noise compare? Well, let me get one. Yeah, that's interesting. And you would have to definitely, if patients are finding that using earbuds, so occluding the canal with music, though, yeah. It is certainly possible, but maybe I'm surprised they can hear them as well with the earbuds in, so that would be something, because the earbuds are occluding, so, that's an interesting question there, Paula, because that doesn't really necessarily fit. so well, but it could be happening. I guess we need to find out what those sounds are. That would take a little bit of time. But your question is interesting, and someone else says they found the same thing too. Then the ambient level room sound devices, like room cleaners and that kind of thing, those are wonderful resources, and you basically want to create a feast of noise in the house everywhere. But the ear level devices, no matter which way you turn your head or move around space, they're with you. So that's a wonderful asset of those devices. You want to really dump sound right into the ear canal with an open fit, and they can certainly wear them full on, and over time they might lose a tiny bit of hearing. But in a long-term picture, misophonics who lose a little hearing is kind of a good thing. So we should probably form some rock bands and things for people to join. Yeah. So let's go back here to the next thing. I see your questions. So it's very specific cases, on using earbuds, and of course they're more sensitive because then you have contrast, kind of relief contrast, we call that in my field of tinnitus and hyperacusis. So when the patient's using their sound therapy, things are good. When they take them off, they are so aware of the tinnitus, and what we want to do is transition. We try to transition those people into different types of noises and sounds, and exercise as well to try to help transition them out of the kind of relief and then exposure. That's a challenge for sure. So scheduling ideas. How to use this sound equipment. And so here's what I tell patients. Use it as much as you need, as often as you need, and wear it at a comfortable level or wear it at a louder level. Try all kinds of earbuds in your tips, ear muffs, headsets. The thing with blocking perfectly functioning auditory systems is protective ear equipment just doesn't work. You can only cut out about 30 decibels of sound at the most. If you put earplugs and special earmuffs on and they're noise canceling, apparently you can reach close to 50. But the sounds that are annoying, chewing, clicking sounds, most of the time there's little components in those that exceed, plus you have the visual component. And this is very frustrating for people actually to try to use quiet to block out triggers. It doesn't work very well. It's better to use sound to flood and occupy both the brain processes and the auditory fibers. It's better to flood the system with sound. And it works better, I think. And then, you try to identify some difficult times and work around those things. And I often tell people to throw out the Norman Rockwell picture of the family at Thanksgiving. Never mind that. Go on a family skiing event. Go on a family hike. Have your dinner. The person with misophonia may or may not participate, and that's perfectly fine. That's not the only thing families do together. In America, we do have in other places in the world, sadly, we have gotten to a point where it's like every time we get together as family, we eat. We eat all the time. They eat all the time in high school and college now, junior high too. In the old days when I went to school, you couldn't eat except at the lunchtime. And now everybody is allowed to bring in food, and teachers are handing out gum. And it's a nightmare a little bit for these individuals. So they have to be able to use their devices, and we can certainly get them permission at school or work to use their devices as they need, and try to help them. And then I have a lot of check-ins with my patients. It's very important to have check-ins that are regular and productive, and it's a lot of work. And that is, I think, key to the sum of success that I've experienced. So what do we anticipate? I'll go into that. Christy, hi, Christy. Nice to see your name there. So, anticipated outcomes. What do we expect if we're going to use sound as therapy? So you're a psychologist, or you're a physician, and physicians, I think, might have trouble with spending this degree of interaction with the patients, but certainly can work with audiologists or psychologist or counselor. And what do we want to anticipate? Well, improved tolerance. To some degree, and we're going to measure that, and it's going to take a while to really figure out, what is happening over long term. And kids are not good at this, and misophones are not necessarily good at also self-assessment either, because they're such a high level of distress, that they're not necessarily good at rating this level of distress with the one they had 3 months ago. So we have to work with this carefully and come up with some ways to assess from a variety of individuals. So what does ambient sound do? Well, it just raises background noise at a cross-frequency profile, which reduces the contrast between a quiet background and the sudden onset of a trigger sound. So the difference in decibel content is reduced when you have sound-generating equipment in your ears. It can give people increased confidence and a sense of control, and that can be very helpful, and also an ability to control some of the impact on the tsunami of the emotive system responses. They report less fatigue, milder mood swings, increase in family happiness, and ability to enjoy some time together. Useful at school or work. We're anticipating a long time use. Initially, I really tried hard to see if we use these for 6 months to a year or 2 years, like tinnitus retraining therapy, would the person eventually not respond to the triggers? And I am sorry to say I have never found that. I haven't found that. They grow up, they get more mature. The worst time for girls is usually 11 to 14 or so, and boys is like 15 to 17, acting out really emotionally distraught, and they get more mature. The brain matures until you're in your late 20s. So, and also adults handle their lives because they construct their lives. They don't go to those places. They're not stuck in a car being driven to school or sitting in a classroom with obnoxious people that bully you, okay? So they make their lives work. And I'm always telling kids, look, you've got 2 more years of high school, and then you need to make your life. You can have a single room in college or whatever. You'll have a lot more control. So we need to increase and work at long-term strategies. And again, the ear-level devices, of course, are useful because you don't have cords hanging down earbuds. Adults are not going to wear iPods to work or shuffles. It's considered rude. You had a lot of trouble with employers, presentation, socially unacceptable. And it's best when you pair up all these things with counseling therapy, because I don't care if you have diabetes or leukemia or, that disease where all your hair falls out, alopecia, or you have some condition, you're going to have emotional issues related to your condition. So counseling therapy, I feel, is paramount for the family, for the person, and that could take lots of different forms. I'm not a psychologist. I know I can say that exposure therapy, I feel, is rather useless and a form of torment for most of my patients. And there certainly have been many attempts at recording the noxious triggers and exposing people to this. And the patients will report to you that it was not that successful. I think that's, looks like Mina, so acceptance-based therapies. Yes, I think things like that with chronic pain can certainly be beneficial. I think we need to supply these individuals with a whole toolbox of tools for a chronic, incurable condition that affects every aspect of their life, basically. You cannot get away from sound. So we have to do as much as we can, and we have to work together as a team of professionals. So here's how do you tell if your therapy is working, if you are, so you're a psychologist and you want to use sound and you set this all up with the patient. Maybe you're an electronic person that is good with things, and, how do you set that up? Well, you can come up with your own pre- and post assessments, questionnaires. With children, you can make little happy faces, sad faces, and neutral faces, and small kids can circle little faces when you ask them a question, and are they better? Are they the same? Are they worse? You can do some creative scaling for your own point of view in your profession. You can certainly use things like the Beck inventories for depression or anxiety. I use those because anybody with a master's degree at the time was able to use those, but I don't think it was necessarily that effective because it's not our field. I've come up with my own things since then. I am very strict about my follow-up schedule with these patients, and I did get a question about that a minute ago. I have a weekly follow-up. Let's say I fit a device on a 25-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 50-year-old. I have a weekly follow-up in the first 4 weeks, and I do trial devices with all of my patients. So they have to put a deposit down, but I want to know that my patients that are using sound devices are only using them because they're helping. I don't want them to buy them and find out that they don't work. So they get a month-long trial, and I have a weekly mandatory follow-up with them, either by Skype, email, phone, something where I can find out how they're doing, and I send them home with a schedule, and I make those appointments before they leave the clinic, and they actually have to follow through. Because when I initially started out, I used to fit devices. I'd send them away. At the end of the month, they'd say, oh, I didn't get around to trying them or something, and that was frustrating. So, and also there might be some funny question they were shy to ask, or, or something happened, they weren't sure about something, and remember, people remember, about 10% of what you tell them. So I have a once a month follow-up with them for at least 6 months. Sometimes it's much longer. Sometimes those follow-ups can go on for several years. I've been Skyping with patients from Hong Kong and all around the world. I think every continent, including the island of Madagascar. These people are everywhere, and they need help. And then I try to do a reassessment with my MAQs at around 6 months, and they're not useful to do. It's very foolish to do like the same assessment every week. I have run into some people doing that lately, and that is not helpful. You have to have a time period between assessments. You don't ask this person the same questions every week. It's just not fruitful effort. So you do want to have like 6-month assessments, and if you can work with the other professionals is very helpful. So let's see, Braggy wireless earphones. Yeah, we use a lot of wireless earphones, and Apple's coming out with a new thing that might even replace hearing aids, and it'll be your Google system, an ear-level device. So the world is going to change soon. What about hypnosis? People have tried it. Again, if the patient finds relief and improvement, good. Let us know if you find that happens. Whatever works. Try it. Everything you can think of, including some kind of strange things, have been tried. But if the patient comes back and says, I'm better, I'm feeling better, this is really helping me, that's fantastic. Okay? I'm a big believer in exercise, by the way. Did the patients become immune to the recording, not the sound? No, I wouldn't say they are immune. We're talking about exposure therapy, if that's what you're talking about there, Tom. They were in a high state of anxiety and rebellious cooperation. Yeah, that's an area that probably could use more study. I mean, Tom has done some amazing work with short-term exposure mixed with very positive stimuli that seems to work for certain people. Again, it's very, very interesting. Okay, and there's another comment here. Not sure. I'm going to have to look at that one. Okay, all right. So we have some comments. I'm going to move along. I just make sure I get through here. Maybe we can come up in discussion there. Not really keeping track of time very well. Let's see.
We're pretty much out of time.
Oh, I went over. I'm sorry.
I didn't even look
at my watch.
I know. You're good.
Okay. Quickly, we'll go over. You can certainly look at this yourself later. Extras, documentation, diagnosis. There is an audiology code in my field for diagnosis, and you probably have codes in psychology. I write a lot of letters for schools under the American Disabilities Act of 1999. These individuals are protected and they can have rights for accommodation, and I work with that a lot. And I want you to encourage people to look at the Misophonia Association and join us. And that is the end.
Well,
sorry about that, Tom.
That's
I
okay.
went 20 years into an hour, I guess.
Let's just put out maybe 5 more minutes for 1 or 2 questions. If anybody has a specific or another question for Marsha. And by the way, Marsha, is my voice cutting in and out now, or is it more stable?
Slightly for me, but not too bad.
Okay. Well, okay.
Yeah, there's a psychologist here from Mr. Keys here. Yeah, lots of different, some contributions here. I'm not sure, can everybody read the
yes,
comments?
Yes, everybody can read the chat box. Tell you what, let's go ahead, Marsha.
I don't have to go over those things.
And go with the next presentation. Let you be the introducer here, and then we'll have some time at the end where questions can come to either one of us. So.
Okay. Well, I really love Tom Dozier. He is a steady man who is willing and was willing to devote time to an area that was so new, and he called me one day, and I actually can't really quite remember when. I think it's been at least
3 years ago, like 3.5 years.
Is it only 3.5 years? It seems like it's been so much longer. Tom called up. I think he had read some things about misophonia, and he had some ideas of things, and he was practicing in a field of behavioral science, and he has a background as an engineer, I believe, as well. Tom had a very creative approach to trying to help figure out what to do about misophonia, and he just jumped in. It was such a relief in a lot of ways because we have a number of audiologists, but this was somebody from a different field and had a totally different point of view of how to approach this, some of these difficulties, and he has just been absolutely a steadfast proponent for misophonia. He has spent just enormous amounts of time developing all sorts of interesting things, including an institute for research. He tries to work collaboratively. He's published a book. He has come and been involved with every one of our conferences. He doesn't take a penny. The ones of us who have formed this sort of movement, we're not taking any money from this. This is a completely volunteer effort, and Tom has been a huge player. He is a kind person, sympathetic and creative, and he brings his data to the conferences and conventions and presents, and I just can't say enough about Tom. He is his own thinker like the rest of us. He's a pioneer, and he comes up with ideas on his own, and I have been very supportive and very pleased to get to work with Tom, and I think I hope you will all enjoy his point of view and open your mind to the ideas he brings. And I'm just very happy to say welcome, Tom, and thank you for everything you do.
It's a pleasure to be part of this. Now, Marsha, if I start cutting in and out, I have another microphone headset. Let me know. I put on my earbuds so that I'm not getting feedback from my speakers. So it's a pleasure.
And should I push my button so my voice is off now?
If you quiet, it doesn't matter. I apologize for my voice. I got up an extra hour and a half early to get over my bronchitis, hacking, and coughing, and so I'm about as good as I'm going to get right now. So I'm going to present on understanding the misophonic response. The misophonia. Oh, I'm getting a feedback from someone. Marsha, could you maybe mute your microphone? Someone has a microphone on, and let's see. Marsha, could you do that? Let's see. I'm not sure if I can even mute your microphone because you have all power. Okay. So, Marsha, are you there? Hello, Marsha.
Better?
Yeah,
Hi.
can you mute your microphone? Something,
Okay. Yeah, I do that.
somebody's touching a microphone or a speaker, and I'm getting some feedback. So, okay, so essentially, I look at misophonia response as a reflex response. It's an involuntary response to a stimulus, and we know we have unconditioned reflexes, we have conditioned reflexes, and we have conditioned emotional responses. Um, so when we look at some of these reflexes, I view a startle reflex as similar to a misophonic response, and I'll explain more why. But first, let me say that look at the startle reflex. You hear a loud sound, and there is a muscle response. There's a jerk muscle response. And that muscle response is an involuntary reflex response. But I also note that you may have extreme emotions with a startle response. I know that my mom's emotions varied quite a bit depending on the situation when I would scare her. And I would have, oh gosh, we could have these little cracker pop devices to the cabinets, and you open a door and it pops. And she was a good sport, but I would often hear a few exclamations after those startle responses from my mom. So with the startle response, there was a stimulus, there was a muscle response, and there was a varying emotional response. Now, fingernails on a chalkboard is also another common innate response to an auditory stimulus. You know, we hear that screech sound, and why do we hate that screech of fingernails on a chalkboard? And if you think about it, you'll think back, and a lot of people just say, "Oh, it's a horrible sound. I just can't stand it." But I say, does it give you chills or shivers? Do you feel the sound? And say, yeah, you know, I hear that sound, and I hate the way it makes me feel. So with fingernails on a chalkboard, again, this is, you know, unconditioned reflex, but you hear the sound, you physically feel something, you have a physical response, and we hate that sound. Okay, so let's look then at misophonia. With a misophonia response, the common perception is that we hear the sound and we have these extreme emotions, both the emotion and the fight or flight, and the physiological distress. What I would like to propose and explain today is that we have a trigger, we have a physical reflex, and we have an extreme emotion. Now, I can't say that we have evidence, proof that it's in this order. There are some other possible alternatives, that I have a trigger, and that trigger simultaneously elicits both the extreme emotions and our physical reflex, or maybe even we have the trigger which elicits the extreme emotions and then the physical reflex. But I have counter evidence to this position. So a possible or proposed misophonic response chain is that we have the trigger stimulus, which directly elicits a physical reflex, usually a muscle reflex, and I'll be providing data on that. That physical reflex elicits the extreme emotions of misophonia. Now, it appears that there are some alternate paths that develop where it can, maybe the trigger does directly, well, definitely the trigger does directly elicit the emotions. Now, extreme emotions have accompanying stress responses that have been measured and demonstrated in one study. And so you have an increased heart rate, sweating, tight muscles, general body tension, just the general physiological distress that comes with these extreme emotions. And this whole chain then elicits or evokes. So elicit is a a behavior that is a reflex, involuntary reflex, and evokes is a behavior that's occasioned by the stimulus. But it evokes mostly coping behaviors. This is going to be people putting their hands over their ears, yelling "shut up," running from the room. Those are the coping behaviors. So this is what I see as it's kind of a 5-step chain of the misophonic response. So some early examples. Part of the reason I didn't view misophonia as having a physical component, I just viewed it as a respondent behavior to a stimulus. And since in behavior analysis we classified behavior as respondent and as operant, then I thought, well, this is a respondent behavior. It's a respondent emotional behavior. What do we know about dealing with respondent conditioned emotional responses? But what I had in some of my first individuals was visible physical reflexes. And in the article Counter Conditioning Treatment for Misophonia that was published in Clinical Case Studies, I talk about working with a woman who had triggers to her husband, and she described her response to a trigger, said it feels like a shovel to run through my chest and out my back. Now she did say that that was somewhat metaphorical, encompassing both the emotional and the physical reflex, but there was a strong physical reflex. And so we did a counter conditioning treatment for that physical reflex, or what did you say, a counter conditioning treatment with very, very mild exposure. And the physical reflex reduced and the emotional response reduced based out of this. But the key here is we had this report of a physical reflex response from this individual. Another very clear case was a young girl, her mother and she came to visit me, and using this counter condition treatment, she was lying down. Mom was rubbing her back to relax her. And when the trigger stimulus occurred, we would hear and we would see her arms and shoulders jerk. Her shoulders would jerk maybe 1 to 2 centimeters from this very brief, very weak trigger. And afterwards, the girl reported that she felt her muscles jerking in her arms and in her legs, but that she had no negative emotions from the experience. So here we were seeing clearly a strong physical reflex, but no emotional reflex. So this, I call this the hidden initial physical reflex. And why is it hidden? Well, the miso emotions are so extreme that it overpowers the occurrence of these physical reflexes. And in some cases, these two individuals, the reflexes were very strong. And in some cases, the reflexes are very mild, very weak. I often have people say, oh, I have a reflex, but it's like putting my hands on my ears, or I start yelling obscenities at the person. But these are coping responses. And then other people tend to recognize their stress responses, lots of tight muscles. In one survey I did, some of the time, 30% of the people felt that they only had an emotional response. There was no physical response. So one way of helping an individual determine their initial physical reflex, and I recommend that if you're working with an individual that you try this, help them to find this reflex, is to let them relax and be very calm, and to give a short, soft, weak trigger. And many times a live trigger will still be too much. I've had parents say, well, you want me to come and sit down beside him and breathe? And no, that would be way too much. But they possibly could have it by making the trigger from a distance, You can often do this by using one of their lesser triggers, something that they're not as sensitive to. I released the Misophonia Reflex Finder app. This app allows you to record a stimulus, a trigger. It allows you then to edit, and editing is trimming off the leading junk, noise, whatever, so that the first thing that occurs is the trigger, and then you can then set the volume precisely and the duration. You can have the duration down, at 0.25 seconds, 250 milliseconds. And at that point, it's going to be, and having it soft, very audible, it will not trigger the person. And then you can slowly raise the duration and the volume until the person feels something. And when they feel something, that first something is their initial physical reflex. So what I found with working with individuals is that about 95% with help can identify a physical reflex. And of this 5%, I've come back at later times with these individuals, and in most of them, we have identified a physical reflex at a later time. The reflexes are generally a skeletal muscle, a flinch, I see, neck, shoulders, chest, all kinds of combinations. Internal reflexes, and these are more difficult to deal with. The stomach constriction, where the stomach is, just pulsing, is tightening. Intestine constriction, nausea, butterflies. Esophagus constriction, some individuals feel like they're being choked. Had individuals with a sexual response, a couple little kids with urge to urinate. Sometimes it's like something in the chest cavity that the person can identify. Or a few have had unusual things like a burning sensation or a hot wave, some feeling heat. So this is a list of 20 of the physical reflexes, initial physical reflexes from 20 consecutive individuals. I had one that had no reflex that we could identify. And you see there's a variety here: abdomen, calves. This individual had a double reflex. So for one set of sounds, they would, if it was a crunching sound, their eyes would squint. And if it was for snoring, they would feel it in their neck. And again, just a variety of different, most of these muscle reflexes, toes curling, feeling it in their thighs. And I had a couple that had a vaginal response. They felt a sexual pulse. So, and I like to share the results of a study that's ongoing, that we're trying to write up at this time. It's being conducted by myself under the Misophonia Treatment Institute, and Kate Morrison, who's a Utah State University doctoral candidate. We have a Sterling IRB, and the objective of this phase is really to document and publish the fact that these physical responses exist, and will also include the emotional responses to weak triggers. So we've had 25 participants. One was excluded because the individual would mix thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations kind of interchangeably and inappropriately. So we excluded the reports from that one individual. What we did is we would meet with an individual, and of course after having appropriate informed consent, and we had a video chat session, and we would test their response to triggers. We'd have the participant relax. We then have a short, soft trigger. Some of these were done with recordings, but most were live. Sterling IRB. Sterling is an independent institutional review board who can, provide review board for independent human experiments. Often these independent review boards work with drug companies device manufacturers, etc., who need clinical trials. Okay, so back to the testing. They relax, a short, soft trigger, and most of the triggers were live. Some were done with recordings. And then we had the participants report how strong was the response on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 was no response and 10 was the worst that they can imagine. We were typically looking for something in the lower range because that made the physical reflex or the initial reflex most identifiable. We asked them what they felt physically and what emotions they experienced. And then we tested the same trigger several times to try to get a consistent response. Some of the individuals had a very consistent response immediately. We tested twice. We got exactly the same physical response both times. We were done. Others had some time identifying what they were experiencing. And we did 2 auditory triggers and 1 visual trigger if the individual had visual triggers and 2 did not. So here's the list of all the physical sensations that were reported by the individuals. And in this case, I have, hands clench, because sometimes the hand would stiffen and sometimes they would clench. Sometimes it would be just a finger curl. Here's a case where I have a trapezius report and neck into the shoulders, which sounds a lot like trapezius. So, but these are just the individual reports, face tightening, different forms of neck, upper back, lower back. And I have a couple of sexual responses, one a vaginal pulsing, and another that was a clitoris sensation. So let's look at some summary of this. So I tried to break these into groups. Out of the total 70 tests that were done on the 24 individuals, about a third had sensations in their arm, 20% in their shoulders, chest, back, abdomen, quite a variety down here. Sexual responses, I mentioned, a little unusual, a wave of warmth. The person described it as a wave from their head down toward their toe that they felt. It's quite unusual from what I've generally experienced with individuals. Two in their toes, and 1 in their face, and 1 in the actual stomach organ internally. They felt it. So I tried to say, well, are these the same reflexes for all triggers, or are they different? So we had 2 to 3 triggers per person. Most had 3. And so about half of the individuals had the same physical response to all their triggers. So for example, they had a hand clench to a sniffing trigger, they had a hand clench to a chewing trigger, and they had a hand clench to seeing someone chew. If I add in the ones that were similar, that all the responses were the same or at least similar, then we're getting close to 3/4 of the individuals. And so here's an example. A person felt it for their first auditory trigger. They felt it in their neck, their shoulders, upper back, upper arms. Second auditory trigger, they felt it in their shoulders and upper back. Didn't report arms or their neck. And for the visual trigger, they felt it in their neck, their shoulders, and they had felt that their head was having a tilt to the left. And so these are, similar area triggers. Then I said, well, how many had at least 2 of the responses that were the same? And that was 75%. So here's an example. They felt it in their shoulders and their chest for their first auditory trigger. And they had kind of, well, maybe here, maybe there, I didn't feel anything, responses for their second auditory trigger. And then the visual trigger, they had the same as the first auditory trigger. And then when I said, well, how many have the same or similar, then we're up to 90%, where they're feeling some general similarity. Here a person's shoulders, upper arms and chest, shoulders, upper body, and abdomen. That's pretty similar. But then they had one that was their whole arms. And this is a good example of had at least one trigger that was completely different. and that was, you know, almost a third uh, of the responses. And so that doesn't make sense. I've got a mathematical error here because I've got 7 occurrences. I believe this is, oh, this is the not the number out of 70. This is the number of individuals who had this. So yes, so 7 out of 24 is about a third. And they would had one auditory trigger in their neck and shoulders, another they felt in their chest, and then the visual trigger they felt in their neck and shoulders. Ask how many individuals had at least one trigger that they said there was no response to, and I had about, you know, 10% to that. So the individual had, you know, hands and arms for their both auditory triggers, but for their visual trigger, they said they didn't have any physical response. And then I said, well, how many had at least one trigger where they reported a specific physical sensation? And the answer was all of them. All of them had at least one trigger where they felt an immediate physical sensation. So then I looked at the emotional responses. What kind of responses did we see? Varying phases of irritation, anger, mild anger, annoyance. Those all fell into the anger category. And these were almost all very mild. One said rage. So 80% of the occurrences. This is of our 70 triggers that were tested. Anxiety, you know, a little over 40%. Escape avoidance and vigilance was reported as coming in here at about 30%. Fair quantity of disgust. You know, a good number where the people said they didn't have any emotional response, 70%. I was a little bit surprised at the reporting of fear, both immediate fear in the situation and fear of more triggers occurring, a little over 10%, sadness, and various miscellaneous other emotional responses. Again, the focus of this study was to document the initial physical reflex. So if we look at this emotional response and how it might relate to the physical reflex, if you look at research that uses aversive stimuli and looks at the emotions that come, aversive odors or taste or heat, you find that they report that aversive stimuli will produce fight or flight responses and just ideation, the thought of fight or flight. We have research that shows that there's pain-induced aggression. One of the things that I would like to note that it seems that misophonia, because of the what's physically felt, is really a violation of an individual's personal space. They're sitting there minding their own business, and they're getting pulsed physically by those sounds. So it's our brains are set up to ignore auditory stimuli, and we can focus in on a specific conversation, and we can tune out other background noises. But with this autonomic nervous system, which I call to patients, the individuals, the lizard brain, this lizard brain autonomic nervous system reflex, it's an electrical pulse of the muscles. You know, it's not like being tasered, but there's a little similarity of a mild shock. And I know that when I sneak up behind my wife very nicely, sometimes in the winter, and reach out to touch her head, her face maybe from the back, and I touch her ear and I draw a little spark, or I touch her cheek and I draw a spark, or even her shoulder, she gets excited. I mean, you know, she responds to that with emotion. So the other thing I want to note that, you know, misophonia anger is not a choice. These individuals try to stay calm, try to not be upset, try to ignore it. but they respond, and maybe they're responding from anger from an aversive stimulus, like the individual that said she felt it was like running a shovel through her chest. Or maybe it's from a weak response that's just intrusive. I will say that we think we identified later what her reflex was, and if you want to try this, if you can close off your windpipe, and if you need to pinch your nose and close your mouth, but otherwise just close off your windpipe, and just try to quickly breathe, and you feel it. You feel it right here in the sternum area. That's what appears her reflex was, so that her windpipe would close, and then she would gasp for breath. And it's a very disruptive, uncomfortable reflex. And it may be that simply that this weak reflex, rather than being intrusive, just also triggers the conditioned emotional response. So again, here's the chain. I believe that this is a conditioned physical reflex, and we can discuss that more either in a discussion section, or I would like to present at a later workshop on why I believe that this is a conditioned physical reflex. There's some work that shows that the extreme emotions are a conditioned emotional response. Sukhbinder Kumar gave a wonderful presentation on some work that's in process that he is doing at the Misophonia conference in October in Chicago, showing indicating from functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, that the areas of the brain that are lighting up are those that deal with associative learning. Okay, so some of the summary of the reflex study. One, we feel that we show that generally the misophonic response to a trigger includes an initial physical response, usually a muscle response, and that is elicited by the trigger. This initial physical response is highly varied across individuals. From person to person, there again, you saw the list of the different physical reflexes. It's highly varied, but within an individual, it's often consistent for that individual. And so that has certain implications. This reflex response is exclusive of stress responses such as general muscle tension, increased heart rate, sweating, the galvanic skin response. These are the kind of responses that were measured and demonstrated in the Edelstein et al. Article, research that was done. And it was a very good report demonstrating that we really do have this arousal, but this is not what we're talking about here with this initial physical reflex. The initial reflex response is exclusive of the coping responses, such as fight or flight behavior, mimicking, yelling, covering your ears, other overt behavior. This is not what we're talking about with this initial physical reflex. We have note that sometimes the initial physical reflex occurs without the individual perceiving an emotional response. And again, we could also note that there were occasions that individuals perceived an emotional reaction to the trigger, but did not perceive a physical response. And we propose or say that the misophonic triggers actually elicit a physical contact, a bodily contact, maybe a form of physical assault even, that is paired with the awareness of the trigger stimulus. And in one of the videos I've done on misophonia, I use this rubber band as a model and say that, you know, getting a trigger is a little bit like having this rubber band. You pull it back and it pops you, right? There's a physical contact that you have from a misophonic trigger. And then finally, the next phase of the study is to empirically validate the initial physical response to trigger stimuli. And we're going to do this by actually measuring muscle, you know, tension, and measuring the timing between the stimulus and the initial physical reflex. Now, I'd like to demonstrate this, if I can, by showing a video, and I think I'm going to need some help because I just clicked on the media player button, which opened a window. I entered a YouTube link and I was told it's not a valid YouTube link. So technical support, can you help me with this? I also have this video uploaded to my embedded content, but I cannot see it when I open that up. So can you help us? Technical support. Well, I'm hoping. So does anybody have a question? Let me see if I can come back. Pamela, I am sorry about the sound quality. Christopher, did the wave of warmth individual also... I'm sorry, I don't get what the rest of your typing, Chris. Blush. Oh, I don't know. I don't know if they also blushed. How about another question here? So, you know, I don't, maybe we had the individual who was maybe making some sounds that was a problem drop off because of background sounds. Yeah, that was probably our technical support person, and he's gone, so we can't get the technical support to play the video. Okay, so next question here. So anyway, that is basically the extent of my presentation. So at this time, let's turn this over to discussion, and I would very, very, very much like to pass the microphone to anyone who's willing to talk. So if you want to say microphone please and ask for the mic, we'll turn the mic over to you for a question, or type in your question. So I have a question here. Could this be similar to certain phobias that have visual triggers with possible physical reflexes involved, such as disgust phobias or spiders and snakes? This is from Helen Toronto. Helen, I believe that misophonia is extremely similar to phobias, and that the let me see if I can start a microphone up here for Dr. Kumar. Marsha, can you see Sukhbinder's login or channel here? There's Sukhbinder. Okay, and I'm also turning on your video if I can, Sukhbinder. Maybe it will or will not, but you got the microphone. So anyway, back Helen, I do believe that this is very similar to phobias, where what we have is a situation where a person is having an unconscious response, and when they're having this unconscious response, they're hearing the trigger stimulus just right before it, and it develops this physical response. So yes, I believe that misophonia is extremely similar to phobias. Okay, Suckbender is still showing me a swirly microphone. Let's see if the system will get you tied in here shortly. Would anyone else like a microphone, or would you like to ask either me or Marsha a question? So while people are questioning, I'm going to make a couple other points. I believe. Okay, here we have one. Okay, from James Keys. Thinking of your analogy with static electricity shock, could we, with informed permission, do disconnection to the stimuli? This is beyond my pay grade. He says in the 7th grade, I became less responsive to peers rubbing feet on rugs by shocking me when I knew it was coming. Okay, let me just say, this is part of why I'm organizing these misophonia workshops, because we need all disciplines and worldviews involved here. Very interesting, James. I have no comment on that, though. But that's just a wonderful, relationship, that's something that was similar that you have seen, that maybe there is something there. Okay, is anyone investigating or using vagus nerve stimulation? There is a device called, the answer is no. Thank you, Marsha, for shaking your head. The answer is no, but there is a device called Nirvana. And Nirvana is a device that has vagus nerve stimulation, where you wear earplugs or earphones, and these earphones stimulate the vagus nerve through the earphones, and they stimulate the vagus nerve in either randomly or in synchronized to the music to create a heightened music euphoria experience. And I believe that this may be possible to be used in counter conditioning in the neural repatterning technique, or the trigger tamer type technique, to create a very positive stimulus associated with these triggers. I think it would be a fascinating study. Who out there will raise their hand and start a research project, a research experiment for that? Anyway, great experiment, great idea.
May I comment on that question too?
Sure.
So one of the differences between misophonia and tinnitus is tinnitus primarily a single phenomena, steady state in most people, identifiable frequency components, and most often a static condition. Misophonia represents, on the other hand, fairly rapidly expanding triggers of a wide variety of pathways, sensory pathways. So if someone did have a single trigger, if that was the case, it might be easier to use some of these approaches. But, when you have maybe 100 triggers or 20 triggers, or you're adding triggers, then it becomes much more problematic.
So, Suckbender, the system will not open up your microphone for some reason, so I apologize for that not opening up. So the next question here is from James Claiborne. Thanks, Jim. The similarity of phobias, are you of the two-factor model of phobias from Maurer involving the respondent and operant conditioning as a model that might fit it? Jim, I am not a phobia expert. I'm speaking more from the fact that phobias are a conditioned response, and I see misophonia as a conditioned response. I do think, from what I've heard, that phobias do have a physiological response associated with them, and I can't go into it any further. I actually believe that misophonia is a 100% generally purely respondent reflex behavior to the stimulus. And this is part of the regard where I like Marsha's analogy for comparing misophonia to diabetes. You can't just tell a person with diabetes, stop having diabetes. Stop that ridiculous intolerance to sugar. Just get over it. And the same thing is absolutely true with misophonia. These individuals have tried their best to ignore, to avoid responding, and they cannot ignore and avoid. And so there's operant behavior definitely involved with the coping behaviors, the coping responses, and the things that are embroiled around the misophonia. But for the basic misophonia reaction itself, I see it as a 100% purely respondent reflex behavior. Okay.
So we have
Yes.
So we have little different viewpoints on those things, and that's what makes the climate rich for exploration, discussion, and coming together positively to share and think about it. Michelle says, she says back here something about interoceptive exposure. That I don't know, so I'm sorry I can't respond to that one. And then we have a personal comment about someone, is this an emotionally based situation related to, familial factors or developmental factors of teenagers with fathers, or, we haven't found any evidence of that. Myself, these kids are still normal teenagers and normal adults in many ways, and factors are present, but that is certainly not a driving factor that I've discovered in my interviews with people over very open-ended interviews. And finally, I think there was a comment here. About, does anybody have a response to someone that's not a familiar? Yes, there certainly are, and certainly I've had a number of patients who don't have any trouble with their families, but have trouble with something in the environment, something random, something odd, so we certainly have a lot of overlap. We're just trying to talk about the middle of the bell curve, I feel, today, which is the typical kind of patient. And Asperger's, yes, people with Asperger's certainly have this, as well as autistic patients. One of my more difficult patients was a 15-year-old boy from Virginia who had pretty severe autism and had misophonia to throat clearing, and that boy was over 6 feet and several hundred pounds, and they couldn't take him anywhere or have him in a classroom with any other students because he would literally launch himself and try to hurt you if you cleared your throat, whether you were an 80-year-old woman or a child. So it can be combined with other conditions. And let's see.
Okay, so let me make a response here. Tom Suit asked, have any cases of misophonia been found that were not threat-based, that is, originally triggered by someone who did not matter? Well, there are cases of misophonia where this is one of the most peculiar, where a girl had a friend who would pick at her fingernails, or kind of pick at her fingers like this, a good friend, and that picking became her first misophonic trigger. So it was a visual trigger that was her first misophonic trigger by a friend of just picking at her fingers. I know another individual who had mockingbirds, and I included this in some of the articles. Mockingbirds built a nest beside his bedroom window, and mockingbirds have the characteristic of chirping 24 hours a day. So here he is laying in bed trying to sleep, and he's getting this mockingbird chirp, and he developed misophonia to mockingbird chirp. So I think both of those are non-threat based. Then there's a question by Sukhbinder Kumar. Again, Sukhbinder, sorry that I couldn't give you the mic. Said, wondering if you could clarify misophonia as a conditioned response, what is the unconditioned stimulus here. Now, there's a very interesting line of research, an article, where it shows that you can have a conditioned reflex not to a stimulus, but simply to a response. And so you do not need an unconditioned stimulus, discrete unconditioned stimulus, potentially. What they're showing is that if we look at most research in physical reflexes, we have an unconditioned stimulus that produces an unconditioned response that occurs simultaneously. So anytime we're doing research on conditioning physical responses, we're pairing both a stimulus and a response with a neutral stimulus to do the conditioning. And so I would like to explain this more in another session, Sukhbinder. But very, very good question.
I would like to add to that, Tom. Just there is a whole area, another area of this phenomena that is a response to the thought of a trigger.
Yep.
Just thinking
Yes.
or imagining a trigger for these individuals can provoke a very strong response. And I have a boy coming in later today that's 16 that is very affected by misophonia, but talking about misophonia is a major trigger for him. So his mother and I have been in conversation on how we can structure a helpful session with this boy where where he doesn't have to talk about the triggers that causes him such a high level of distress. So there have been other studies done on brains. For example, if I raise my arm, I can measure that in my brain. If I think of raising my arm, it's a very similar process that happens in my brain. Even if I don't raise my arm, there's a shadow phenomena apparently that can be tracked. This is a whole area for misophonia that would be wonderful to do some research on. I don't think it would be that difficult to put together. And maybe it would help us understand why these innocent noises that just don't bother the vast majority of the population or sites, why they trigger such an extreme response. It's not rational, is it? So there's work to be done.
There's lots of work to be done. I want to make a comment a bit, Marsha, about having psychologists and clinicians work with an audiologist. There's two good reasons for that. One is the audiologists who are involved with misophonia are often looking for someone to refer clients to. So they need, audiologists who know about misophonia need your help. And it's also been very good for your clients, for those that can afford and will benefit from the ear level listening device, noise generator. So again, that's just a plug there for.
I think it's critical, and I wanted to say in my clinic I have Ms. Shade Hardy, a psychotherapist, about 35 years old, African American clinician who has misophonia, believe it or not, and she works with the patients here in Portland who have misophonia. So, that's a unique thing, isn't it, to have a psychotherapist who has the condition?
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, a couple of comments here from Michael Tompkins. Does perhaps food aversions would be a better model? Great comment. I don't know. I think that's a good thought. James Claiborne that says a parallel to PTSD where triggers may include sounds and both physical and emotional reactions. Again, I think that's another very good, reasonable area to investigate similarities of what's actually going on here, which we know, and those who know more about PTSD, like Dr. Claiborne, would be a very good one to pursue this, right? Pittman and Orr, okay. I'll talk to you about that later, Jim. So I do believe, let me just get the last few, see if there's a last comment that we want to respond to. Our time is up. And I do not want to run this too long.
Yeah, time to go to work.
Okay, so unfortunately, I cannot answer these questions right now. If anybody wants an answer afterwards, would be great. Let me click over here and do the final wrap up here. We need would first off thank you very much. Thank you, Marsha. Thank you for all the participants. When you exit, there'll be an opportunity to take a Whiz IQ feedback survey. Please do that, and please pass any suggestions you have